Kevin Schofield is here, always a man to get you out of a verbal trap. Political editor at HuffPost UK. How you doing, Kevin?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Ian. How are you?
All right, yeah, the tongue was twisting a little bit there in that last moment, but glad to have you with us. I mean, let's pick up on that, the Whitty. It's worth just reminding ourselves again what he said. This, of course, he still is the chief medical officer, saying that the government may have overstated the dangers of the pandemic. Let's remind ourselves once more of what he said to the COVID inquiry yesterday.
I worried at the beginning, I still worry actually in retrospect, about did we get the level of concern right? Were we either over-pitching it so that people were incredibly afraid of something where in fact their actuarial risk was low, or were we not pitching it enough and therefore people didn't realise the risk they were walking into?
So there it is. And naturally, as you'd imagine, Kevin, you know, this has kind of opened up another debate. And, you know, that there are some on social media in particular saying, look, the government admitted they got the whole thing wrong. It's not quite what he's saying there, but he is acknowledging that it was a very fine balancing act.
He is. And I remember very well going to the very early briefings at the time with Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance before lockdown, when this was still at the very early stages of the pandemic. And one of the things that they warned about was when we were asking them, are you going to lock down like they've done in Italy at that time? And they were very worried that people wouldn't stick to the rules, that if they were told to stay at home, they might not stay at home. And that was their big concern about lockdown. Now, it would appear then that they have decided, well, if we're going to get people to stick to the rules, what we've got to do is really put the fear of God into them, which I think they did, really. And if you look at how people adhered to the guidance that they were given, I think it took everyone in government by surprise exactly how much people did stick to the rules and do what the government told them. So yeah, they were definitely effective in getting that message across. But it is very interesting to hear him say now that actually, in retrospect, they may, and he's not saying that they did, but they may have gone a little bit too far.
I guess I mentioned that thing, groupthink, a second ago, Kevin, and there's probably a little bit of that going on. You know, they're looking at other countries. I remember, I always tell this story when we talk about this, being on the school run and, you know, queuing up to pick my little boy up from school. And parents were talking about this. You know, have you seen what they've done in France? They've closed all the pubs. And, you know, is it going to happen here? And I remember thinking, God, people are so daft, aren't they? They really start... That's how rumours start, by saying, is it going to happen? Of course it's not going to happen here. And then, of course, about half an hour later, it happened here. And everything closed down. The hairdressers, the pubs, the bars, the restaurants, people's businesses. Some never reopened, of course. And I think... I don't know whether it's naivety, whether it was, again, the groupthink moment, the fear of the unknown. Remember Boris Johnson's address to the nation, many of you are going to lose loved ones before their time. And, of course, that was true. I've spoken to people in government that said, actually, some of the predictions were horrific that they were looking at, far worse than it turned out to be. Somebody hadn't made those up. These were potential scenarios that could happen. Now, if you're the bloke in charge of calling the shots, you've got to make a decision. Which way do you go?
Yeah, and I think they definitely decided to err on the side of caution. It's interesting you mentioned that speech that Boris Johnson made at the time about people losing loved ones before their time. I remember watching that in the office in Parliament, actually, and that was the moment it really struck home to me. You're thinking, my goodness, this is the Prime Minister of the country saying that people are going to die. And you'd never, ever experienced anything like it, never thought you would. And I think, personally speaking, that was the moment when it really hit home to me. I think I decided that day, I'm going home now after work and I'm not going to come back until we're told it's safe to do so. So yeah, it was certainly effective. And you're right, if they're looking at numbers and they're the people in charge, they're the people who are ultimately going to be held responsible for those decisions. If they're looking at numbers in the hundreds of thousands of people dying, you can absolutely understand why they would decide to as I say, err on the side of caution.
And remember those images, Kevin, of Italian hospitals, wasn't it, that were absolute carnage of patients laying in corridors. I mean, they were, you know, hundreds a day were, almost by the hour, were being taken into hospital with, you know, horrendous respiratory conditions and clearly had got COVID, and they were struggling to cope. So our government were also seeing those images too.
They were, and we were all watching them at the time, absolutely aghast, thinking it's like something from a Hollywood movie, as I recall. And, you know, if you remember, at the worst of it, certainly in the first lockdown, when you were getting those daily press conferences, you know, it was not unusual for the Minister of the Day to announce that, you know, in the last 24 hours, more than 1,000 people had died, which, you know, looking back at it now is absolutely extraordinary. So yeah, absolutely, you can understand why, as I say, they might well have maybe over-egged it a little bit, just to kind of get it across to people that it was a very, very serious illness indeed. Indeed.
Let's move to this story. We touched on this. In fact, we did a whole phone-in, Kevin, yesterday about, you know, do you treat child killers as adults when it comes to the court and sentencing and the like? Of course, there is a distinction between how you both treat and how you sentence children who are guilty. This is the story of the two boys believed to be the youngest knife murderers detained for a minimum of 8 years and 6 months. I think many of us, even by juvenile sentencing standards, were expecting it to be a bit longer than that. But let's have a little listen to Chief Superintendent Kim Madil, who made this statement after those sentences were made.
Today's sentence can never make up for Sean's life being taken, but we hope it can bring some comfort to all those who loved him. Sean was only 19 when his life was taken at the hands of two boys, then aged just 12, who had armed themselves with a machete.
Armed themselves with a machete, Kevin, 1/2 metre long, pretty much, this machete. They didn't know the guy. There was no grudge or explanation behind it. It was completely random. These boys become the youngest murder convicts since Robert Thompson and John Venables back in the 90s, of course. Are you surprised by that sentence? Because even allowing for the juvenile nature of this crime, that didn't seem to be very adequate. 8 years and 6 months for a crime as barbaric and as horrific as this.
Absolutely, it does seem remarkably lenient. I mean, you've got to imagine that the judge clearly has followed the sentencing guidelines. He's the one who's listened to, you know, all the evidence and has come to this conclusion. However, if you put yourself in the shoes of the victim's family, I mean, 8 years and 6 months does seem a fairly derisory sentence, and you must feel that they don't think that they've had the requisite justice. Now, it makes no difference, clearly, sadly, you know, the victim can never come back, unfortunately, so it doesn't matter whether they get 8 years or 88 years. However, there does need to be some sense that justice has been done, and it doesn't feel, certainly, as though 8.5 years is sufficient for someone's life.
Indeed. Kevin, stay with us. Kevin Schofield, political editor at HuffPost UK.